I am starting the recording. Uh, well, it's good to have you here today. We're going to be dealing today with the Gospel according to Luke, and so as a way of just getting started with things, I want to very quickly just mention what we've done the last couple weeks. Uh, we had dealt with the Gospel of Mark, which has an emphasis on Jesus' suffering and death. So much so that there are no resurrection appearances in the Gospel of Mark in terms of Mark's original material, which ended at 16:8. For Mark, Jesus suffered and died because he humbly served others. And because of that, God, after Jesus' death, vindicated Jesus. For Mark's audience, or for Mark communicating to the audience, Jesus' own suffering and death provides the model, the meaning, and Jesus' vindication provides the hope for Mark's suffering Gentile audience. It's very clear that Mark's audience is Gentile. Whenever there are any Jewish practices, whenever there are any Aramaic words, the language that Jesus would have originally spoken, Mark always translates those for his Greek audience or explains those Jewish practices. Last week we looked at Matthew, and in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus' teachings and Jesus' rule as Messiah, which becomes possible as a result of Jesus' resurrection, that becomes the central element. The resurrected Jesus now rules and properly interprets Torah, interprets law. Living according to Jesus' interpretation of Torah, Matthew says to his audience, that's a legitimate way of being Jewish. And it's also something that is applicable to Gentiles. It's clear that for the Gospel of Matthew, nothing, absolutely nothing, drops out of Torah. That remains. And it's also clear that Matthew's audience includes people who are from Gentile background. Let me remove my mask here. It includes Gentiles, and those Gentiles are expected to be Torah obedient as well. Matthew's gospel is not a missionary document. It's not directed to people outside Matthew's own community, but rather Matthew provides basically a way of defending, provides his audience with a way of defending their own Jewishness against people who would criticize their Jewishness. And the Gospel of Matthew was written at a point where we find that yes, there were criticisms of Matthew's community. Matthew is writing after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. The Jerusalem temple had been the very center of Jewish life. How can you remain Jewish and not have a temple? How can you remain Jewish without being able to do the sacrifices which are required, supposedly? And at a place called Yavna, sometimes called by its Greek name Jamnia, at Yavna, rabbis gathered after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, and basically they reconstituted Judaism as a way of being able to function in Torah obedience, but without using sacrifices. Matthew is written during that same period of time. Matthew provides an alternate way of thinking about how to be Jewish. Well, today we're going to be dealing with the Gospel of Luke. Gospel of Luke is half of a 2-volume work. The book of Acts was also written by the same author. At the very beginning of Luke's, at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, at the beginning of Acts, we find that there is material talking about the connection between these two types of books. They were apparently planned as a 2-volume work, but they were done one at a time, with the Gospel of Luke appearing first. The Gospel of Luke is written in excellent Greek. It's some of the very best in the Greek New Testament. And in fact, a lot of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts rival some of the very best Greek works in Greco-Roman literature. In the very first session of this series, I quoted this section that begins the Gospel of Luke. Mark had begun with the words, beginning of the Gospel of Jesus, Messiah, Son of God. Matthew began with the book of the genealogy of Jesus, son of David, son of Abraham. Luke starts this way. Since many have undertaken to set down a narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us, etc., I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. Well, it's kind of strange that the author of Luke says, hey, there have been a whole bunch of other things that have been written about Jesus. We might think, oh, since so many things have been written, what's the point of me writing something else? But instead, Luke says, because of all those things, I too decided to write. And to write an orderly account for you so that you may know the truth. There's a criticism of these other books, these other writings about Jesus. And we know that on the basis of examining the relationship of the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, we know that when Luke wrote his own gospel, that two of the writings that Luke was criticizing was the Gospel of Mark, one of his sources, and this other saying source that scholars simply call Q, from the German word Quelle, meaning source. For Luke, there's something problematic about those. But when we look at this statement referring to an orderly account, we shouldn't understand that orderly account to be primarily a matter of chronology, of what came first, then what, then what, then what. We know that isn't the key issue, because largely Luke follows the sequence of the Gospel of Mark very carefully in most cases. Now, there are some notable exceptions, but those shifts that Luke makes in his Mark source does not seem to be made on the basis of historical reasons, but on the basis of theological reasons. He makes the shift in order to present the story of Jesus in an order that can be more comprehensible, can be grasped, and see the outlines of what Jesus was doing. So orderly account doesn't necessarily mean more historically accurate, but, okay, a better theological read. Now, this Theophilus, the reference to Theophilus, we have no idea who Theophilus was. We don't know whether Theophilus was a real person. The word Theophilus means lover of God. Is this just a way that the author of Luke Acts uses to refer to his reader? You, reader, you, lovers of God. Okay, that's who I'm writing for. Others have suggested that Theophilus may be Luke's patron, benefactor, the one who basically pays to have this project done. Probably a wealthy person who pays the rather considerable expense of writing a handwritten document. Writing materials were extremely expensive. And thus that's a very good possibility. Some have suggested that Theophilus might be a Roman official. That seems less likely, although this phrase, most excellent Theophilus, that was a very standard way of referring to Roman officials. But it simply seems to be something that Luke uses as a way of viewing his reader in high esteem. Last week when we looked at Matthew, we commented that Matthew contains an awfully lot of the Gospel of Mark, and Mark is this purplish sphere here. Gospel of Matthew is what's outlined in blue. Luke's what's outlined in red. And you can see that Matthew has included most of Mark within this gospel. Luke, not so much. Luke uses a lot of Mark, uses the majority of Mark, but Luke has also eliminated a number of things. Luke draws on the same cue source that Matthew does, but Luke also has a lot of special material that is unique to Luke's own gospel. So, how do we understand what Luke did in using particularly his Mark source? Mark begins with what in terms of the ministry of Jesus? What does Luke start with?
Mark? Wasn't it the baptism?
Okay, with the activity of John the Baptist and with Jesus' baptism. And it goes through the crucifixion, the empty tomb story, but it concludes very strangely with the women fleeing from the tomb in fear and trembling, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid, period, the end. Very odd. But when we look now at what Luke does with Mark, we can first note that Luke ends up eliminating some major chunks of Mark's story. Now, Luke is going to eliminate individual items elsewhere in Mark, but I just want to call attention to two rather large sections. There's a series of 5 miracle stories, beginning with Jesus walking on the sea. Luke gets rid of that. And with the next 4 miracle stories that Mark had. Now, Luke's elimination of those stories seems to be in particular because, well, those stories are rather similar to other things. Luke is writing actually a massive work. The Gospel of Luke is the longest book, the longest of the 4 Gospels. It's the longest book in the New Testament. And many have said, hey, the length of Luke, the length of Acts as a separate book, those are just about at the maximum size that you could use a scroll. If the things were written on a scroll, as often was the case, if you write something longer than that, the scroll becomes so enormous, it's just unwieldy. And it appears that Luke, because of all this other stuff that Luke wanted to include, got rid of stuff that seemed to be really not adding anything new about Jesus. It's kind of similar to other things. There's another sea rescue story. In this batch of materials that gets eliminated, there's a feeding of the 4,000. Well, Luke's already got the feeding of the 5,000. What do you need the 4,000 for? That seems to be a good part of the activity. But when we look at the Gospel of Mark, it's really a whole cycle of material. There's, at the beginning of this section that Luke eliminated, Mark says that Jesus commanded the disciples to go to the other side, to Bethsaida. And from that point until the story of the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida, the fifth of those miracles, that whole stuff, this Bethsaida cycle, was completely eliminated by Luke. There's also a section that Luke eliminates that includes the story of the beheading of John the Baptist. Luke has a lot about John the Baptist, more than any other gospel. But Luke gets rid of this story. It's kind of a gruesome story. And apparently that doesn't serve Luke's needs real well. Luke also gets rid, in this section, material that in which Jesus is presented as prohibiting divorce. Luke gets rid of that. And frankly, if we look at Luke's gospel, we will find that there are a number of places where Luke has some pretty rough things to say about marriage. Luke isn't particularly in favor of people getting married. And if they are married, it appears that Luke thinks it's okay to not be married. And this is all connected with Luke's particular way of looking at how people live in their own period of time. He just seems to have this ascetic, monkish, if you will, kind of way of looking at things. But these are interesting things to see what Luke got rid of, or what Luke got rid of from Mark. Well, Luke takes this material that's left and he rearranged, or he splits it up in some different ways. Where in this spot where the miracle stories were eliminated, hey, Luke ties those things together, sews the stories together in a very neat way. If we didn't have the Gospel of Mark, you'd never know that something was missing there. But Luke then opens up the material, and we find Luke adding some big blocks of teaching material, drawn mostly from this Q saying source, and from his own unique material, this special L material. Luke adds a section that contains what Luke describes as the Sermon on the Plain. And we find that Q material is what Matthew used and expanded for Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. But hey, Luke's inserted that. But what's really striking, okay, is that whereas Matthew took these teaching materials and created 5 different blocks of teaching materials, 5 different sermons, Luke takes a huge amount of this stuff and shoves it all into Jesus' trip to Jerusalem, where he's eventually executed. So, I mean, we've got a 10-chapter insertion that is largely this teaching material. Okay. Luke also adds that literary prologue that we mentioned, in which he explains what he's doing. Luke also adds birth story. But there's something weird about the addition of birth story. And that's that, he starts with the birth of John the Baptist. That's peculiar. Luke, and only Luke, describe John the Baptist and Jesus as being cousins, being related in some way. And as I mentioned, Luke has a lot about John the Baptist, but there's some strange stuff that occurs with that, and we'll pick up some of that in a bit. Here. Luke also includes the only story that the New Testament has of something from Jesus' childhood, namely the story of Jesus being present in the temple when he was 12 years of age. Well, at the other end, we have resurrection appearance stories added. Now, Mark ends with a resurrection announcement by the young man at the tomb, saying, the young man says, looking for Jesus who was crucified. He's not here. He has been raised. He's going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Well, Matthew, instead of having the women be silent, Matthew said the women went to tell the disciples the resurrected Jesus met the women on their way there. The resurrected Jesus basically repeats almost verbatim what the angel had said. And then we have the 11, the 12 minus Judas, going to a mountaintop in Galilee and encountering the resurrected Jesus. We have, this is the climactic scene in Matthew, in which the resurrected Jesus announces that all authority in heaven and earth has been given to him, and he then gives the Great Commission, go make disciples of all Gentiles, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always to the end of the age. Now, Luke has the women go to tell the disciples. There is no appearance in Luke of the resurrected Jesus to the women as they go. But what's really striking in Luke is that the resurrection appearances in Luke are only in and around Jerusalem. The story of Jesus meeting a couple of followers on the road to Emmaus. Beautiful story. That's only in Luke. Jesus meeting the disciples in a locked room in Jerusalem. hey, that's something Mark doesn't have. That's something Matthew doesn't have. But Luke also says that the resurrected Jesus commanded his followers not to leave the city until after, turns out to be Pentecost, 50 days later. And, Matthew's story in which the disciples first see Jesus on a mountaintop in Galilee, there's no possible room for that in Mark's story. In Luke's story. Because they'd been told not to leave the city. And from Luke's perspective, once Jesus has ascended, and ascension is something that we've never seen in Mark or in Matthew. Once Jesus has ascended, the kind of resurrection appearances that Luke has talked about, those are viewed as ending. From Luke's perspective, there would seem to be no room for that meeting on a mountaintop in Galilee. Very puzzling kind of materials. But Luke has Jesus spending 40 days with multiple appearances there, eating and drinking with Jesus, the resurrected Jesus. Very striking material. Oops. Well, let's just kind of pop out of this and open things up and have us look at some of the things that struck you as you were looking at the Gospel of Luke. We don't have sound coming through the TV, but we do have it coming through my computer. Is there someone online who, since you didn't get a chance to speak to the rest of the group during last week, is there an observation that you want to make about things that struck you as repeated themes or emphases that were present in Luke? Brian.
Yeah, you already noted the birth stories, but I just noticed Matthew has some of that, or has a different birth story, but most of what we really cherish about the Christmas story comes from Luke. It's much more detailed and just to me the most cherished parts come from Luke.
Okay, let me repeat for the people here in the room. Brian had mentioned the birth stories, that the birth story that Matthew had and the birth story that Luke has are very different. Matthew has the story of the wise men. Matthew has Mary and Joseph's hometown being Bethlehem. They've always lived in Bethlehem. In Matthew's material, if you read carefully, they never go to Nazareth until after they travel to Egypt, after the killing of the young children. They go to Nazareth for the first time after they get back from Egypt. Luke has Mary and Joseph being from Nazareth. They travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. We've got the no room at the inn business. We have the manger. Those things that are very often a key part of how the Christmas story is told today. Those things are largely from Luke. And Matthew's material, that becomes part of the celebration of the Day of Epiphany within the church year. But there's there's no indication that Matthew or Luke know anything about one another's stories. And in fact, the details clash. It's not possible to have, according to Luke, Mary, Joseph, Jesus being present in the temple a few days after Jesus' birth. And yet, Matthew saying that they're in Egypt. That doesn't compute really well. And that helps us recognize that what these authors are doing is presenting some thematic kinds of things. For Matthew tells the story of Jesus' infancy after a pattern of the infancy of Moses, in which when the child Moses was born, there was an attempt to kill off children. And for Matthew, the connections between Jesus and Moses are very, very important. And so Matthew ties the story of Jesus and Moses together at multiple points. For Luke, Luke is echoing some other Old Testament stories. For Luke, we find that he's going to pick up a lot of themes of the prophets, the songs that are part of the infancy stories in the Gospel of Luke. Those are celebrations of events within the Old Testament, and I mean they're beautiful. Reverend Grace had presented a whole series during Advent on the songs from the Gospel of Luke. These songs seem to have been early Christian hymns, probably used in Luke's own community, which he's woven into the story, so that as the story of Jesus' birth, the anticipation of his birth is told, people are able to hear things that are part of their own worship life. It's a very, very clever way of putting things together. Other observations. Yes, here in the room.
The genealogy.
Okay, the genealogy. There is a genealogy in Luke. Yeah. It does not begin at the beginning of Luke, but it occurs, rather strangely, after Jesus' temptation in the wilderness and the beginning of Jesus' ministry. In Matthew's genealogy, begins with Abraham, the ancestor of the Hebrew people, has this very stylized 14 generations down to David, 14 generations down to the deportation to Babylon during the Babylonian exile, 14 generations to the birth of the Christ, the Messiah. For Luke goes back to Adam, and there seems to be a definite reason why Luke does that. A major theme in Luke's gospel is the significance of Jesus for all of humanity. Luke is a Gentile, and Luke is very interested in the inclusion of the Gentile world. Matthew was zeroed in on the Jewish world for the most part. But for Luke, Gentiles are important. And thus, in Luke's genealogy, has that going all the way back to Adam, who is specifically identified as Son of God. Adam, Son of God. Now, when we look at the movement from David, King David, down to Jesus. Matthew had 14 generations, then another 14 generations, 28 generations from David to Jesus. Luke has over 40 generations for that same period of time. Matthew has the genealogy going through the whole line of Davidic kings who were descended from David, Solomon, etc., going all the way down until the Babylonian exile when Davidic kingship ended. All of those kings are part of Matthew's genealogy. The only king in Luke's genealogy is David. From David, Solomon isn't the next person in line. Oh, it's some kid of David's named Nathan. We don't hear about a Nathan who is a son of David in the Old Testament. Okay, it just goes through this kind of an anonymous or nondescript set of figures. For Matthew, it was essential that Jesus is from the messianic line. He's from a kingly line. For Luke, not so much. Yeah, Jesus descended from David in some way. But it's a more roundabout kind of way. Both those genealogies go through, or both genealogies are described as being the genealogies of Joseph. It's impossible to have two genealogies that go through Joseph. It's biologically impossible. But this again helps us recognize that what the gospel writers were doing was not trying to give historical information. They were trying to make other kinds of points. For Matthew, the point about Jesus' kingly credentials, that was crucial. For Luke, that's not important. But being able to have that genealogy, go back to the first human, and to say that Jesus is significant for all humanity, that's really, really very important. The fact that Luke's genealogy refers to Adam as son of God is a reminder that some of the very quick language that we often use, in which we borrow language from another gospel, the Gospel of John, which we look at next week, that refers to Jesus as the only Son of God, something picked up in the Nicene Creed. That's not the way the Synoptic Gospels talk about Jesus, and that's not the way the Synoptic Gospels talk about Son of God. Son of God is a term that can be applied to a bunch of different people. And the Synoptic Gospels assume, and sometimes explicitly say, in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, that sons of God are included in their audience. That's how Jesus' followers are talked about. When both Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer and Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer encourage the audience to say either our Father who's in heaven, or, according to Luke, just Father. If Jesus' followers are being asked to call God Father, apparently, these Gospels expect that their own audiences are to view themselves as sons and daughters of God. as children of God. And that Son of God is not what distinguishes Jesus from everybody, but rather Jesus as Son of God is what Jesus calls his followers to become. And Jesus shows people how you do that. Matthew's Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called, the Greek has sons of God. Exactly the same word applied to Jesus. For Luke, those people who love their enemies, people who are generous to others, they are called sons of God. That's worthwhile noting. Our usage tends to be different. There's nothing wrong with our usage as long as we understand that our usage is not the only usage, and that 3 of the 4 Gospels are going to talk about these terms in ways differently than what you and I do. Other observations. Anybody else online with an observation about Luke? Okay, Joe.
When I went through this, my first assumption is that genealogy is passed from man to man.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I got to the part about Joseph and Jesus, it dawned on me, or at least occurred to me, that Jesus was the son of God, not the son of Joseph. And so it would seem that the lineage would stop at Joseph and not proceed on to Jesus.
Yes.
So show me where my thinking is off.
Your thinking is perfectly fine. And as I mentioned last week, Matthew recognizes that, having a genealogy that goes through Joseph, that's problematic for stories about virginal conception. And Matthew recognizes the problem. Matthew ends up having Joseph officially adopt Jesus by having Joseph be the one to name Jesus. And in Jewish tradition, that makes Jesus part of that family line. Okay, Luke doesn't provide that kind of explanation, but you'll note in Luke's genealogy that when it speaks about Joseph, the father, as was supposed, of Jesus. Okay, Luke recognizes, yep, there's a connection here. Luke doesn't dwell on trying to explain that in some way. It's just there. But your recognition that there is a tension there, that's true. Yes, Michael.
Luke seems to have a lot about Mary, and from Mary's point of view, Magnificat.
Yes. Luke tells the story of Jesus' birth from Mary's perspective. Matthew tells it from Joseph's perspective. And yes, that's a really important thing. It's worth noting, though, that for both the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, the story of the birth of Jesus plays no role whatsoever in the remainder of either of those 2 Gospels. Why? Oh, they're largely following Mark's story. Mark didn't have a story, a birth story of Jesus. Matthew and Luke are the only 2 books in the entire New Testament that have that refer to anything unusual about Jesus' conception and birth. All of the New Testament writers, except for Matthew and Luke, apparently know nothing about any circumstance unusual. And as we noted, Matthew and Luke have two very different stories that are difficult to reconcile with one another. It's an oddity. But as Christians, okay, to be honest with what the text says, and then to say, okay, what do we do from here? How do we function with these differences? Okay, what the text says has to be acknowledged, and to recognize that, oh, some of the obsessions that we have for trying to have everything work out in a nice, neat system, that's not what the biblical authors, the New Testament authors, were worried about. They seem to have been able to function very well with that combination. And as we look at the formation of the New Testament canon, okay, the New Testament canonized, put into the approved set of books, the authoritative books, it canonized diversity. It didn't say, here's the one way you've got to think about Jesus. And as we've looked at these three Gospels that we've looked at thus far, we find that, there are very big differences. One of the things, mentioning just as we wrap up here, since we're almost out of time, one of the key things is that for Luke is writing to a Gentile audience that is trying to make its way in the Greco-Roman world. It recognizes the continuity with Israel, but it goes beyond Israel. It recognizes that, hey, Rome is in charge of things. And it encourages people to function as good citizens within the Roman Empire. You don't make waves. You don't bring the wrath of Rome down on you. But there's a way in which you can function as followers of Jesus in the Roman Empire in ways that contribute to society. The concern for the marginalized, concern for the poor. These are major emphases in Luke. Concern for women. Major emphasis in the Gospel of Luke. These are things that are important elements in how you live in following Jesus. There's a lot of emphasis on ethics in Luke's Gospel. And being a decent, ethical person, that's crucial, according to Luke. And for Luke, Jesus saves, not by dying. Jesus saves by providing an example of what God intends all people to be living like. That's the important element there. Next time, we're going to be dealing with the Gospel of John. And I hope you've taken a look at the Synoptic Gospels that we've looked at. For this next week, read the Gospel of John. It's drastically different. Drastically different. And from that material, okay, we're going to find themes, emphases that many of us in this room feel more comfortable with than we do with the Synoptics. But it's really important to see that material. Why does John tell the story of Jesus in this radically different way? That's our task for this next week. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to those of you online. Glad to have you here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Mary.
Bye-bye.